Latimer City Expats Club is a non-profit social organisation and our speakers are volunteers. The club as such assumes no responsibility or liability for the professional reputation of or the quality of services provided by the speaker today.
To give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about today and what we're not going to be talking about today. Everybody's heard of climate change, formerly known as global warming, but I think climate change is probably a better descriptor of the phenomenon. By a show of hands, how many people here think climate change is a man-made problem? About half. And how many people think that climate change is a natural phenomenon? About half. And how many people have no idea? And we got a few hands. Okay. So we're not going to discuss whether climate change is man-made or natural. That's not the scope of this presentation. What governments have done, I think we can all agree that climate change is real to some degree. We're seeing cases of more dramatic hurricanes, more flooding, more drought, more fires. So our climate is changing one way or another, and as a result, all governments have got policies in place to mitigate the fact of climate change under the assumption that it's a human-caused problem. So what we're going to be talking about is all of the green agendas by the various governments and what's basically happening, trying to mostly reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we're dumping into the atmosphere, assuming that that's the cause of the problem. Again, the science, there's two sides to it, and I think the split in this room indicates that very well. Disclaimers. I'm not going to read this because I think you can all see that, even though it is a little bit fuzzy on this big screen. We've done research in an attempt to present what we were able to find. Again, not being experts, we can't say whether this is 100% true or false. It's based solely on the information we were able to gather from numerous sources, and that's where this is all coming from. So I think that's pretty much self-explanatory. Okay, so here's what we're going to be talking about. These are the items that affect the government's green agenda, basically trying to reduce CO2 emissions is the goal. I'm going to be spending some time talking about EV cars. And following into EV cars, you need batteries to store energy. It also comes into play when you're generating power with mechanisms that don't produce power at a 24/7 basis, like solar, for example. You need batteries to go with that. And then Bud's going to get into more detail about the power generation and that sort of stuff. You want to add to that, or?
Good morning, everyone. I'll just comment on the section I'll be speaking of. I'm going to cover our energy sources, where we as a society get our energy from, historically and in the future. So I'll be breaking it into two parts. First part will cover what's considered green energy. That's better.
That's better.
And the second part will be traditional fossil fuels. A little bit beyond that, I'm going to try to cover, as brief as possible, what are CO2 emissions, why they're important, and finally just cover where we're going in the future with our needs. The reason we're focusing on EV cars, batteries, and power generation is because these are major impact to our society and major impact to CO2 in the environment. So that's our focus today.
Okay. So, EV cars. I heard a comment in the audience. So benefits of EV cars. They're quieter, we got less noise pollution, which is also a disadvantage because if you don't hear one coming, you're more likely to get run over by one. So there's that. EV cars are interesting because with a combustion engine, you actually have to build up pressure in the engine to generate torque for acceleration. EV car doesn't have that problem. It's battery driven, so whatever power's in the battery you can deliver to the wheels instantaneously. So the acceleration is way more pronounced in an EV car than in a conventional combustion engine car. They work really good in urban traffic where you've got lots of traffic lights and lots of stop and go traffic, because when the car is stopped, it's not burning any energy. Whereas with a combustion engine, it's constantly burning fuel. And then when the EV car goes, it only consumes the power that it's actually using to go from A to B. So in an urban setting at low speeds, EV cars are ideal. For long-range trips on the highway at high speeds, yeah, you're pretty much screwed. You're not gonna get there. The other interesting thing about EV cars is when they're actually driving down the road, they don't produce any CO2. It's just power coming from the battery, which is what the governments are after. The question is where did the power come from that charged those batteries? And we'll get into that. And then there's the hybrid vehicle, which have been around a lot longer than EV cars. So you've got batteries and a combustion engine, and that's sort of the best of both worlds. Because when you're sitting in idle traffic, the engine's not running. You're not generating, you're not wasting any fuel. And if you're in stop and go traffic, you're running off battery. But then when you go out on the highway or at higher speeds, the engine kicks in, starts burning conventional fuels, and charges the batteries at the same time. So it's a nice blend. They're just more expensive. Disadvantages of EV cars. Charging time, and I'll get into the details of this, but you can't just go to the gas station and fill one up, at least not today. For the higher speed chargers, they're not everywhere. You got to go find one. The outdoor ambient temperature affects the battery runtime, and I'll show you some slides of that, where if it gets too cold or too hot, the amount of energy stored in the battery drops dramatically. And the batteries are expensive, and I'll show you some numbers on that. And the other interesting thing is that the batteries in cars are what's known as lithium-ion batteries, same batteries that are in your phones. And I'm sure you've all traveled on airplanes, and there's restrictions. They talk about you can't put lithium batteries in the cargo hold. And if you're going to bring a lithium battery on an airplane, it can only be up to a maximum certain size. Well, the reason for that is these things are very dangerous. The chemicals inside that make it work are very toxic. And if you get them hot enough, it'll actually burst into flames and potentially explode. And you get what's called a thermal runaway reaction, where it just continues to burn, and they're almost impossible to put out. And I've got some good examples of this. So on airplanes, they actually have a bag. And if you end up with a lithium fire on a plane, they can take the phone or whatever's on fire, put it in the bag, and contain it so that you don't actually crash the plane. You actually can stop the fire from spreading, which is why there's a limit on the size, because those bags are only so big. And it's the same batteries that you have in the cars, just the ones in the cars, there's a lot more of them, they're a lot bigger. And then there's the recycling, and we'll get into that, of how difficult and how little lithium's being recycled and where all the components to make these batteries come from. And then, of course, you've got the energy from the electrical grid, which is how most people are going to charge their batteries, and how much more power do we need, and how much power do these cars actually consume, and the costs of electricity to charge them. So we're going to talk about all that sort of fun stuff. So there are 3 types of chargers for EV cars. If you're going to have a charger at home, it's going to be a type 1 charger. So you're looking at about 8 hours to charge an EV car. An average EV car from empty to full is going to take about an average of 8 hours. Now, or approximately 8 hours. Now, this is just a guess because the batteries might be bigger, the batteries might be smaller, the temperature might not be ideal. There's a lot of variables that go into this. So this is just a rounded off assumption. A type 2 charger you might find in a commercial parking garage or on the street, connected directly to the high voltage lines of the power pole. And you can get substantially more power out of a charger like that. So you're looking at 1 to 2 hours to charge, which is not an ideal if you're going down the highway, because you drive for a couple of hours, then you park for a couple of hours, and you drive for a couple of hours. It's going to take you forever to get to your destination. So type 1 charger is something you have at home. Type 2 charger is something you find out and about in public, and you pay to use these with your credit card or whatever. Now there's also a Type 3 charger. Now Type 3 chargers produce way, way, way more power and can charge the battery way, way, way faster. So, in a best case scenario, you can take, 15 minutes to charge your car. Biggest problem with these is none of these actually exist today because they draw a lot of power. So supply is an issue. So you can't. There's actually none of these available today, but I'm sure there will be eventually. And there's a lot of humor around EV cars, as illustrated by this slide. And here's an example of not going green. Here's a diesel generator attached to a Type 2 charger. So when the car drives around, yeah, it's not emitting any CO2, but how much CO2 is generated by the diesel generator while your car is on the charger? I don't think we've got any advantages here. And if you look at the law of diminishing returns, using diesel to generate electricity, to generate motion, you get a little bit of loss each step down the way. So this is a losing proposition here, so we're not getting ahead, but there you go. The next slide is a short video, and it's basically, this happened in China, and it's basically a bus that started with a tire fire, but it's an EV vehicle, and you can see how fast a fire can spread with the newer technology.
Yeah. 哎呀妈，这人咋的了？哎呀，这还有拉杆箱吗？不行了，不是他半天才开门呢。知道的。
So I think you can see how dangerous these types of fires are, just looking at how fast it spread, how violent it got, and what's left of the bus. Not much. Now, if you go to YouTube and Google lithium fires, you'll find thousands and thousands and thousands of videos of anything from cell phones exploding into people's pockets to lots of these fires. And the biggest problem with these fires is you just can't put them out. You either need a Type C or a Class C fire extinguisher. A regular fire extinguisher won't do it. By show of hands, how many people are familiar with the fire triangle? Okay, we got a couple hands. Basically, you need three things to have fire. You need heat, you need a fuel, and you need oxygen. And the way you put a fire out is you remove one of those three components and your fire goes out. When you put water on a fire, you're basically trying to reduce the heat. And if you remove all the heat, the fire goes out. When you use a fire extinguisher, you're generally trying to remove the oxygen from the fire to put the fire out. These things burn so hot and so fast, you need Class C extinguishers, the only way to remove the oxygen, or a ton of water. And by ton, I mean ton, and you'll see that in a second here. The next video shows, I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's 2 minutes long showing the same thing, but basically you've got a bus with batteries on the top that catch fire, and you can see how violent the fire is.
Brad, I'm going to comment here while you're loading the video.
Go ahead.
I just want to mention one other concern that comes with batteries is that there's no preemptive warning they get hot, but if you happen to have a battery in a car or you don't notice, it is without warning that these either get on fire or can explode. So there are things you can do to prepare for this. I would recommend you have a bag at home, approved bag for your house. But Brad, did you load any videos regarding like the motorbike exploding? Some people put their motorbikes inside their house, even keeping your car in the garage. If they are lithium batteries, it's very risky for the reason you're about to see. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bud. And the other interesting thing about lithium batteries, I'm off on a tangent here, is that they degenerate with use. So the sweet spot for all lithium batteries is between 30% and 80% charge. As soon as you charge a lithium battery beyond 80%, you reduce its shelf life. So it holds less power and eventually will just die. The same happens at the other end of the spectrum, below 30%. When you kill one of these things dead, you've reduced its lifespan continuously. And that's what the phone manufacturers want, which is why they've got their batteries designed the way they are. They've got enough smarts in there to keep from overheating them, causing an explosion, but not enough smarts to preserve the lifespan of the battery, so they last about 2 years. If you just leave them plugged in at full all the time or run them to empty every day, you'll get about 2 years out of them, and then they won't hold a charge at all. But you can get a lithium battery to last 10 years or more if you always keep the charge in the sweet spot, which can be difficult to do depending on your application. So here's an example of a lithium thermal runaway reaction. So this was in Paris. Just picture your phone in your pocket doing this. So this video goes on for a while, but I think you get the idea. The next video is basically an explanation from the Austin Fire Department about trying to put one of these things out.
When it comes to fighting car fires, the Austin Fire Department says electric vehicles pose a different type of challenge.
It is more difficult to fight. They are trying to engineer new ways to fight them.
While rare, AFD has responded to a couple electric vehicle fires in recent months. Division Chief Eddie Martinez tells us that these types of fires can be challenging to put out.
If the fire gets into the battery pack, they do something which is called thermal runaway, and if it gets into the battery pack, it takes up to 40 times more water than an average car fire.
On average, Martinez says it can take 20 to 40,000 gallons of water to put out an electric vehicle fire versus the 500 to 1,000 gallons for a gas vehicle fire.
The problem is they protect the batteries so well that, because they don't want this to happen, so they protect them so well that it's hard to actually get the water on the fire.
Even when the immediate threat is put out, Austin Fire says there's still the potential for a fire to reignite with an electric vehicle.
It's self-heating once the battery's been compromised. And that's the same thing with any lithium-ion battery, even a small drill battery. Once you compromise the integrity of the structure that's keeping that battery safe or the pack safe, it has the potential to start heating up and catching on fire.
Martinez says the threat for an electric vehicle fire can be greatly reduced. He is urging owners to stay up to date on vehicle recalls and to use proper charging equipment.
For them having them in their house, use the approved charging device for the car. You can buy off-brand ones. It's better. It's recommended to use the one that's approved for your vehicle.
Martinez says improperly installed chargers can lead to problems down the line.
Okay, so you can see the issues with that. They are very difficult to put out and very hazardous. Moving on. Oops. Come on. One more. Oh, maybe not. Okay, I was talking about temperature of how it affects the batteries. So if you have an ambient temperature of minus 20 degrees Celsius, your battery is good for 50%. You lose half the capacity of the battery at minus 20 degrees Celsius. Not ideal for cold climates. At minus 10 degrees Celsius, you only lose 40%. At 0 degrees Celsius, you only lose 20%. So we're talking about the freezing point of water here. So you get 80% charge in your battery at this temperature. Plus 10 degrees Celsius, you get full charge. So on a cold Thailand day, you're there. At 21 degrees Celsius, you get 115% charge. Real sweet spot. But how many places on the world are at 21 degrees Celsius all the time? Usually you're above or below that. And if you get to 40 degrees Celsius, again, you lose 40% of your charge. So the sweet spot is room temperature or a little bit below. Anything outside that, and you lose a lot of the capacity of the battery. Not only that, when you're outside of the temperature range, charging them charging them at the wrong temperature is also hard on the batteries as well, reducing their lifespan, so there's that too. And again, there's been a lot of mention about heat. And heat is very important when it comes to lithium, because when you charge them, they get hot, and the chargers actually monitor the temperatures of the batteries, because if you overheat them, they will explode. You'll start a thermal runaway reaction if you get them too hot. So sitting at 40 degrees Celsius and charging it, it's way riskier than charging it at like 10 degrees Celsius. The other thing about lithium batteries, if you've ever seen one, they are sealed in an airtight container. And the reason for that is because the chemicals inside are toxic, so you don't want to be exposed to them. And when those chemicals get exposed to the regular atmosphere, they become unstable. So you can end up with fires and other things once the structure of the battery itself has been compromised. How many of you have ever had the battery in your phone swell? Handful of people. So if you look at the battery, it's basically inside a plastic bag. And when the battery starts to expand, what's happened is the battery has been overheated, and a byproduct of overheating is a gas, and the gas that's released is what's filling the bag. And you can do that for a while, but eventually, if the battery gets swollen enough, it will explode because it just can't expand anymore. It's almost like a balloon. Eventually, it will pop. So if you've got a phone with a swollen battery, you need to replace that battery sooner than later before it becomes a real hazard. Now, there's the cost of batteries. This seems to be the average price from every receipt I could find online. To replace the battery in a Tesla is about $22,500 US. So you're looking at doing that between 8 and 12 years. You're probably looking at having to replace the batteries. I've also seen receipts for GM vehicles. The numbers are usually higher than this, and I've seen them upwards of $30,000 to do a battery replacement. So keep that in mind. You buy your car, you're going to have this expense at some point in the future. Now, for lithium batteries, the key ingredient is lithium, which is one of the elements on the periodic table. And this gives you an idea of how much lithium is in each of these different types of devices. So cars obviously being the largest amount of lithium because of the size of the battery, and a phone would be the smallest because of, again, the size of the battery. And recycling lithium. We're not really doing that. About 1% of lithium batteries today are being recycled. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, it's difficult to do because you're dealing with hazardous materials, so you need the right infrastructure to be able to do it. The other problem is logistics. You need to get the batteries to the recycling plant, and there's no mechanism for that today. So as we get more lithium batteries, there'll be more of them, which will simplify the logistics of this. But it's going to be it's going to take a long time to get up to the point where we're recycling most of this lithium. Now, what makes up a lithium-ion battery? Well, there's a few different components here. We've got graphite, we've got copper, and you'll notice that there's plastic is one of the layers. I will explain the significance of this in a second, but that's basically what it looks like on the inside. And this is where all this stuff comes from. So you can see we're dependent on countries like China, Russia, you know, who we're having issues with trade with now. And then you've got other developing companies like Chile. DRC in Africa is a big one because that's where most of the cobalt comes from, and that's used with a lot of medical applications. Now we're also consuming it for making lithium-ion batteries, and it's a poor country, so they're just going to strip mine it to death to produce as much as they can. So again, when we're talking about the environment, is this really helping the environment, or are we just creating a new and different problem? There we go. So oil is interesting because more comes out of oil than gasoline. You get kerosene, and there's certain plastics and rubbers, and it's used in various components. So when you take a barrel of crude oil, a small percentage of that will be gasoline, and you get jet fuel and kerosene and some other stuff out of there. And then you get a whole bunch of components that are used to manufacture products we use every day.
We'll be covering the energy crisis soon, so this might be relevant.
Disaster averted. So here's a list of 144 common things that are made from oil. So you see things like paint, there's medication, fertilizer for growing food. It's a very long list of things, and if we stop drilling for oil, we're going to have to find alternate ways of producing all of this stuff. It's a long list, just to give you an idea of what oil is used to produce, plastic being the big one. So if you've got plastic inside a lithium-ion battery because it's required, and you stop drilling for oil, what are you going to use to make the plastic to make the battery work? I don't think anybody's answered that question. And that's about it for my part. I will let Bud take it from here.
Thank you, Brad. Brad focused largely on EV cars and the batteries. I'm going to touch a little bit of overlap on the batteries in a few minutes, but my focus is on our energy sources. Let me get used to this here. Which is the forward? Right here. Okay. You're going to have to to work. Hopefully I can get this to move. There we go. So I broke it down, my presentation part, in two categories. The energy sources labeled as green, which are solar and wind, as the primary use today, and the primary direction that most of the green agenda policies are leaning towards. There's a lot more effort put into solar and wind. I'm going to cover this in depth in a moment, but I want to go through the list and knock out the other green energy sources that are much more straightforward. Thermal, hydro, and tidal are very good sources of energy. They are relatively inexpensive, reliable, and clean. However, they all have limitations of where we can use them and how much energy they can produce because of their limited use. So they can help us with about 6% of the global energy needs. So it's a part of the solution, but a limited part. Nuclear is another excellent choice for us. Relatively inexpensive, reliable, and clean. Yes, it's considered clean. Even though there's nuclear waste, that is a much easier problem to resolve than some of the others on the list, and I'll go into more detail of that in a minute. Coal fusion is very promising, but at the moment it's still being designed, needs more advancement, and it's quite expensive. So we haven't gotten there yet. That's not really a valid energy source yet. And e-fuels, how many have heard of e-fuels? E-fuels is something that came up very recently, and it's basically a hybrid, cleaner way of creating a source of energy for vehicles, similar to gasoline in use, but it's based on recycled carbon, e-methane, and sorry, what else is it? Sorry, missing something there.
Yeah, it's a combination of carbon recycled from the atmosphere blended with hydrogen. So when you burn it, it burns like gasoline, so you get your heat and away your engine goes, but it also produces CO2, but the CO2 was captured from the atmosphere originally, so now that's a wash. So now it's technically carbon neutral because you're using the same CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. The downside is the amount of energy it takes to create it in the first place, to actually capture the carbon and produce the hydrogen from water, so the expense to make it's insane. So is it carbon neutral? Maybe. Depends on how we generate it in the first place, how it's created.
Yeah, it's the cost that seems to be the biggest concern. Germany's trying to develop and get this approved as a green energy source. It may be used in very, very limited situations in the future, but again, it's probably never going to hit 1% of our energy needs, so that's not really something we can discuss at this point. Moving on. Okay. Here we go. Pardon me, I'm trying to get used to where to look on this new monitor here. So the energy source we've labeled as dirty in the past, fossil and organic fuels are listed here. Natural gas being the cleanest of it. It's in large use today. It's relatively inexpensive, reliable, and available. We are increasing our use for this today, but it's a small percentage of how much gas and diesel and oil we use. This is promising for the future. As I started to mention, oil, gas, and diesel is majority of our energy sources. Over 97% of our transportation system is based on oil. This, according to the Green Agenda, is a dirty oil. New technologies are filtering this on a regular basis. It's getting cleaner due to technologies. So we should be reevaluating this as far as whether it's our best choice. And to be honest, I'll explain this later, but it's basically our only choice for most of our energy source needs for the next 100 years, for the reasons that'll become clear. Wood and coal, I don't know how many of you are aware, but we're still using a lot of coal around the world. Wood is still used as well. These are considered dirty energies, dirty CO2 production emissions. Unfortunately, because of how policies are being applied today, a lot of these wood and coal plants are actually increasing in production and in the number of coal plants and wood around the world, which is actually adding to CO2 problem. So again, we're just trying to clarify some areas that may need improvement as we go on. The last topic I want to bring up is, what is the green agenda? And just the big picture, how are our green policies being used, and is it efficiently getting rid of the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere in a productive way? Let's see. So, humor me here for a minute. Have you heard of unobtainium? It's the magical energy found in the movie Pandora. I'm sorry, the planet Pandora from the movie Avatar. Environmentalists seem to think they found this on Earth in the form of solar wind and solar and wind. They think all the energy that we need can be supplied by solar and wind farms and enough batteries to store the energy reserves for our society. The simple truth is we can't. No matter how much money, subsidies, or superheroes we throw at it. Nor should we want to, not if our goal is to protect the environment and allow our civilization to continue. You know what that is? Hello?
Yeah, and maybe turn the volumes down just a bit, so Skippy on the mics. Skippy, turn the mics down just a little bit.
Down a little. Turn the volume down just a little, Skippy. Thank you. All sources of energy have limits that can't be exceeded. Today we're getting about Today we're getting about as much energy efficiency as we can from solar and wind. The major drawbacks to solar and wind is they only work when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing, making them unreliable energy sources. There are two solutions to this. The first is we use fossil fuels as a backup to provide energy when solar and wind cannot, meaning that we will still use fossil fuels in large volumes. The second, anyone hear me? Okay, I'll keep talking. Please put your hand up if you can't hear me. The second is using batteries to store the captured energy. But physics says this is impossible to use in large scale. When the facts are examined, it just isn't possible to replace fossil fuel energy storage with batteries on a large scale. The reason our modern civilization exists is because we found cheap and plentiful energy in the ground. And for our civilization to survive, we must continue to have cheap, plentiful energy. For something to be cheap and plentiful, every part of the process in producing it, including every input that goes into it, must be cheap and plentiful. Yes, the sun is free, the wind is free, but the process of turning sunlight and wind into usable energy on a mass scale is far from free. Solar and wind may be capable of producing 6 to 15% of our power needs, and that is an excellent help. But be careful what we wish for. This comes at a big price. Today's batteries are simply not capable of storing the amount of energy needs for civilization. Consider the world's biggest battery factory, the one Tesla built in Nevada. It would take 500 years for the factory to make enough batteries to store just 1 day worth of energy used on a U.S. electrical grid. To put this in perspective, the USA stores its energy reserves in the form of oil and other fossil fuels, keeping anywhere from 570 to 735 million gallons of oil in stock consistently for the last 70 years. enough to provide the U.S. with several months of energy to the entire U.S. in case of emergency. If it was not for this vast energy reserves we have, it would jeopardize civilization entirely, change the way we conduct our business our entire life. This helps explain why wind and solar currently still supply only 3% of the energy for the world after 20 years and billions of dollars. Aside from the economics, if your motivation is to protect the environment, you should want to rethink solar and wind and batteries because, like all machines, they are built from non-renewable materials and also need large amounts of fossil fuels. Consider some sobering numbers. A single electric car battery weighs between 500 and 1,500 kilograms. Fabricating one of these batteries requires digging up, moving, and processing more than 250 tons of earth somewhere on the planet. What powers these machines? Fossil fuels. To get the same amount of energy from solar and wind that we now get from fossil fuels, we are going to have to make massive increase in mining. This isn't speculation, this is physics. Lithium, cobalt, copper, iron, and many other metals, materials, and rare earth metals, we will need them all to utilize wind and solar. And then those materials will need to be turned into motors, turbine blades, solar panels, batteries, and hundreds of other components that will be made with fossil fuels. With current plans, the world will need an incredible 200 to 2,000% increase in mining. Where's all this going to be coming from? Massive new mine operations, some in places we all want to protect. Australia's Institute for Sustainable Future cautioned that a global rush for energy materials will take miners into places, wilderness areas that have maintained high biodiversity because of they have yet to be disturbed. Then there's the waste. Wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries have a relatively short lifespan, roughly 20 years. With current plans, the International Renewable Energy Agency calculates that by 2050, the disposal of worn-out solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries will constitute over double the tonnage of today's global plastic waste problem.
Can I just interject here, Bud?
Yeah.
When we're talking about solar panels, when they're new, they produce a certain amount of power. And as you expose them to sunlight, which they need to function, they produce less and less power over time. They start to degrade. And the estimate is, assuming you take care of them, they've got about a 20-year lifespan. Problem with solar panels is they're full of toxic materials as well. So now you've got to deal with the recycling of all the stuff inside a solar panel. So let's say you decide that you want to take your home off the grid and you want to be energy neutral. You're going to spend X number of dollars buying solar panels, buying batteries so that you can produce your own power. Fine, you can do that. Now, if you take a look at the cost of how much a kilowatt hour you pay the electric company, you could figure out what the cost to put the system in is to break even. You'd have to run your solar cells for X number of years before you broke even on what it would have cost you to buy the same amount of power from the power company. If your solar cells don't last as long, now you're losing money. If your solar cells last longer, now you might save a little bit. But again, it's a continuous cost. You're going to have to keep replacing them every so many years to keep ahead of it. So it's, again, a not ideal solution, and it's not an infinite supply of energy. It's a finite resource, and it will eventually burn out.
If I recall, it seems like it's about a 1% loss per year, plus, like you mentioned, maybe 20-year life cycle.
Yeah, that's on average. And depending on the cost of power, like in Thailand, power, I forget what it worked out to. Was it was it 15 cents or 10 cents a kilowatt hour? I forget what it worked out to. In Thailand, solar power actually doesn't make any sense because the cost of electricity from the grid is pretty cheap. Whereas in someplace like California, where the cost is 25 cents a kilowatt hour, then it might make more sense because now the cost of the materials is less than what you'd be buying it from the solar company. So it's very, it's very regional in nature. Question?
I just was going to say, I put in solar panels a few years ago at my house in Connecticut, and I figured the break-even point was 7.5 years, and that we're basically on target for that.
And that was here in Thailand?
I was in Connecticut.
In Connecticut, okay. Yeah, you got to do your math, see if it makes sense for you. But again, there's so many variables. Will the solar cells last as long as you predicted? You'll find out in 7 years.
We'll cover that in a little more detail. Thank you for your input and your comments, Brad. Keep in mind that the amount you paid for the solar panels is a fraction of what energy costs went into making it, because subsidies, which I'll cover in a moment, were reducing the cost and encouraging people to buy more energy, solar panels. Going on. So all this use of solar panels and wind turbines may create whole new environmental challenges. Before we launch the biggest increase in mining, digging up acres of pristine land and creating epic waste problems, we should be sure we reconsider all our, sorry, that is annoying. We should reconsider all our inexhaustible supply of hydrocarbon fuels that are making our marvelous civilization today. Skippy, could you go to the next slide, please? Okay. No, next slide. There we go. The following comparison are typical of renewable energy sources compared to fossil fuels. Shown is a comparison of cost between oil and solar wind development, just the development part. The cost to build either one of these is roughly the same. Oh, jumped too far. However, when we look at production, storage, and recycling of each of these, there's a different picture. While the oil rig produces 10 barrels of oil per hour, the turbine generates equivalent of 1 barrel per hour. And more importantly, it costs less than 50 cents to store 1 barrel of oil, or its equivalent of natural gas, but you need $200 of batteries in order to hold the same equivalent amount of energy. When you do the math on this, in our example, that's $5 to store 10 barrels of energy in oil, and $1,000 to store the same energy in batteries. Next time someone says wind and solar and batteries are a magical solution to the energy problem, ask them if they understand the costs to the environment and to your pocket. Unobtainment works fine in the movies, but we live in the real world. We have to deal with reality. Okay, we'll get to some real numbers here. So, oil, natural gas, coal provide 84% of the world's energy today. In 2003, that number was 86%. So in 20 years, we've reduced our use of oil by 2%. As I mentioned earlier, oil still powers 97% of all global transportations. So we really aren't transitioning away from oil, just not happening yet. And this chart helps explain why. As far as storing energy, there's a tremendous difference between fossil fuels and how we have to store energy in lithium batteries and other battery systems. You can see hydrogen would be ideal, but that's not available widely yet because it's still very expensive. But gasoline, diesel, kerosene are very efficient. Natural gas should be up near the top of that list too, but it's not shown. A little further down, you see coal and wood are still 10 to 20 times more effective than lithium batteries. A very similar chart, but a little bit inversely related. We're showing the costs of each type of energy source, and you'll see the lower cost as wood and coal going up the scale a little bit to natural gas and oil and propane, and electric is a big variable, but solar is the most expensive. Electric varies, ironically, based on how much solar and wind power is on the electrical grid. If there's a lot of solar and wind, it could be double what you're seeing on the screen there. So there's a direct relationship between how much solar and wind power plants are on the grid and how much your electricity cost will be. I'll explain that in just a moment. I'm going to use the countries that have developed wind and solar the most. They're using them in the highest percentage on their electrical grids as examples. And we see that in this chart. It's Denmark, Germany, Spain, UK, Italy, Australia are the ones I'm pointing out, but these are the top countries in the world that are utilizing wind and solar. Here we have the prices in the most expensive places on Earth where you can buy electricity and the costs. And you're going to see there's a direct correlation there. A few variants in the case of Japan and France. They're still using a lot of nuclear power, although they're phasing that out as well. So their costs are, that's why they're on the list, but they're a little lower on the list. What I want to point out with this chart is that the blue area is the actual cost of the electricity, and the black area is the subsidies and taxes. So in the two countries that are most advanced using solar and wind, can you hear me? Two countries that are using the most advanced solar and wind are also the two countries that have the highest subsidies and taxes and the highest overall electric costs. This is an article from this week. I don't think this is working at all.
Yeah. Try. I don't think it's the mic. I think it's the volume. They're trying to fix the sound. Try the.
Hello? Hello? Is this better? Better. Okay. This is an article from Sunday. And it's been coming out frequently from many different sources, but this was generated from the German Energy Service. And they're pointing out that there have been a number of outages in Germany and in Europe, but more importantly, they're expecting over the next 5 years more and more power problems, more and more outages, and getting longer in duration. Again, as we move more toward solar and wind, the stability of the electrical system becomes degraded. There is solutions to this, but this is one of the growing pains, I guess you'd say, when we're moving toward green energies. Kind of just covered this. We should keep reevaluating our use of fossil fuels because they've become quite a bit cleaner than they were in the past. And they're still, by far, our cheaper options. And not just in producing, but you think about the cost of converting all our systems over to the more green energies and the problem we have with batteries. It becomes very apparent we need to keep some oil and gasoline for a long period of time. There's a concern, I'll mention that a little more in a moment, where we're shutting down a lot of the oil development, and I think it's premature to do that from what we're seeing in the numbers. We need to keep reevaluating to see which direction we need to go to. Question. Let's see, where is this? Let me see if this is right. Sorry. Okay, sorry, let me move on. Slides are a little out of order. Here's a picture of Germany's electrical grid system, how much electric is being produced and by which sources. You see in blue, the majority of the energy is being produced from oil and natural gas. And in white is solar power, and then in red is the wind power. So other than seeing the big difference in production, more importantly, notice the up and down of the wind and solar levels of production available. It depends on if the wind's blowing and the sun's shining. It happens that most of the time when the wind is not blowing and solar is not shining is winters, and that generally is the time they need the power the most to heat up their homes. So it's multiple problems are hitting at the same time, and this is why Germany is having some electrical grid concerns for the future. I was going to ask this question ahead of time, but here's a list of which countries use the most fossil fuels. And I'm guessing most of you would have thought it was China, maybe India. Again, this is per capita, this is per person. I have a few reasons to point this out. So obviously, Singapore and Qatar are small countries, so their footprint's not quite as big. But they're very wealthy, so they're able to buy all kinds of luxury items, so their countries are quite expensive. US, Canada, Australia have been developed countries for a long time, so I understand why they've got a lot of energy needs. Same with most of Europe that's on that list. So what do you think is going to happen when other countries that are quickly developing and needing more energy, how is this going to affect our CO2 emissions? It's going to make a huge difference, and I'll show you that in a moment. I will point out that Thailand is ranked near China, which is somewhere around 40-ish right now, and India is a little bit lower than that, around 55. So if you understand, most of Thailand is still not using a lot of energy, it makes more sense to understand where China is. And China and India are growing very rapidly right now, so this is a concern for our near future. This is a picture of the CO2 use around the world, which using color codes to show who's contributing to the CO2 problem most. Unfortunately, this display doesn't cover it very well. For some reason, the gray and the orange are almost blended together, but there should only be three countries in red here, and that was Saudi Arabia, the US, and I believe Australia. The others are more of a light gray, but you get the idea that the countries that are producing the most are already developed, and it's at least 50 to 60% of the world that is within 30 to 40 years to needing massive increases of energy because they're developing so quickly and modernizing. And therefore, you're looking at 30 times more CO2 in the atmosphere, potentially, if we don't move the green agenda forward properly. As I just kind of covered a little bit of this. So it's very important we create policies that are fair to the whole planet. Is it fair for us to say to India, China, and other developing countries, no, you can't have power? But if you look at our current green agendas, the limitations they're putting on countries, it appears that way. It just may not be realistically thought out globally. Again, do your own research, but when you look at the numbers, they're wanting the CO2 emissions to go down for the next 30 years, and you can see it appears it's mathematically going to go up unless we change our plans. Let me catch up here. Again, we're showing the growing need for energy over history. In the last 200 years, you can see some drastic increase in power needs. This is directly due to civilization, development, modernization, and the Industrial Revolution. But again, the Industrial Revolution was based on our cheap, reliable energy being available, which has been virtually entirely on fossil fuels. So how are we going to change and move to something else in the future is the big question. One of the last areas I want to touch on is energy needs for the future. And this falls into two categories. As technology advances, which it always does, we've always found more ways to use energy than to create it. And the cloud, for example, where we're storing all our data, now uses 10 times more energy than EV cars. It's actually the third largest energy use in the world, higher than the entire energy use of Japan. Drones, logistics, as I mentioned in the past, they've been 97% based on oil. This is being moved over to many different logistical technologies, robotics, that's helping things be more efficient. But again, all of these use much more energy than we used in the past. We don't know what will happen in the future as far as the amount of energy needs, but we can be sure we're going to need a lot more, not less.
You missed one off your list that's a huge one. Cryptocurrency, mining. Yeah. That the power is just insane for what they use to generate cryptocurrency.
Yeah. Again, this is extremely brief. He's absolutely right. Cryptocurrencies, when they do mining, you need tens of thousands of PCs online and high levels of energies that are being used. And there's infinite, the amount of new technology requiring PCs is being developed is going up tenfold a year. I mean, it's a lot more than you can imagine. So, getting close to finish here. It appears our energy resources are not being used optimally. Nuclear plants are being shut down instead of building more. Those are a fairly no-brainer solution in my mind, that they're relatively inexpensive, they're clean, they're reliable. We should be focusing on increasing these. There are concerns over properly taking care of nuclear waste, but technology has ways to address those today. Oil drilling is being limited or entirely stopped in many countries. The US has banned it for 3 or 4 years now, which is crazy because now we're importing oil from other countries, making fossil fuels come in from around the world, and it's just adding to the cost, and it's not efficient. Solar, wind, we discussed that. They're drastically increasing electrical costs, and these costs aren't fully visible to most people yet. I think Germany is subsidizing solar, wind, and other forms of renewable energies to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. At some point, that's got to be paid. It is showing up in taxes, but again, taxes and subsidies are hiding the truth for the moment. We're not saying solar and wind do not have a place. They absolutely do. We want it to be, we would like to see it more evenly distributed based on the efficiencies and the costs, because if you make them too expensive, what's happening in places like Europe and other places in the world. They're now turning on coal plants because they've shut down other systems, and turning on wood plants, wood burning plants, because the other alternatives are too expensive or simply not available. So you have to weigh which is worse, going to absolutely terrible energy or telling people you have to abide by these green policies that are ineffective. Yep, no problem. 1 minute. I think I got it covered. Last shot. So summarizing, as I mentioned, nuclear seems like our best option for the long term. Hydro, tidal, thermal are very clean and cost effective, so can be a big help. Solar and wind energy can play a small role, but there is a growing danger. They can do more harm than good if we overemphasize these and make them either too expensive or unreliable for us to provide us electricity. Wood and coal are considered dirty, and they're increasing in use. We should be considering investing in more oil, gas, and natural resources. That's what's built our civilization. And shutting these down without an alternative energy source is very dangerous. No other energy sources are available, such as coal fusion, for the near future that we are aware of. Things could happen, but right now, nobody I've seen says anything that's likely to happen in the near future. Okay. And
Okay. For questions and answers, I think the easiest way to do this, based on the size of the room and the shape here, I think it would be easier if Bud and I went up into the audience with the microphones, and we could take the questions that way. So I'll take this side of the house. If you want to take that side, and we can just take questions and then answer accordingly.
I'll let Brad go first.
Sure.
Find a body.
Yeah, could you provide an overview of hydrogen? This seems to have been lost in the conversation.
Yeah, we didn't talk about hydrogen specifically. Hydrogen is a good fuel. The way you get hydrogen is you basically take water and you split it into hydrogen and oxygen, and that's basically what the space shuttle used. It burned liquid hydrogen and oxygen to get into space. The byproduct of burning hydrogen and oxygen is water. So yeah, it's a really good fuel. The problem with hydrogen is storage, because it's a dangerous gas because it's very explosive. Take a look at the Hindenburg. It was filled full of hydrogen. And the cost generated. It takes a lot of electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. So in order to burn hydrogen, you have to make it, and to make it's expensive. So it is a good fuel, but there's a lot of things that need to be worked on before we can go down that path. But that's probably our best option if we can figure it out. Have you got a question up there, Bud?
Yep, got a question coming.
Hello. Very interesting talk, but a lot of the points you brought up are a little bit sort of confusing. I'm not quite sure where the both of you stand, but to me it seems the biggest problem is overpopulation, and I think we need to get rid of 50% of people. Now think about that. You might laugh. Yeah, I'm looking at all us old uns, right?
What?
Hang on. There was just a minute, there was a film bought out with Harrison Ford called The Blade Runner. Now, they had a simple idea. When you were 36, you had an implant in your hand and it flashed. So you had to go to a carousel.
That was Logan's
and
Run.
it took you up and you disappeared. Good idea. And stop cutting down trees.
Yeah, exactly.
It's too late, I think, because they supplied the oxygen in the world.
You're right, and reducing the population by a huge number would solve the problem. And we're not going to get into that, but there are organizations on Earth that are actually looking at how to do that. But that's beyond the scope. But if you look at the number of Earths that it takes to produce enough to feed and house and all of us, we're at like 1.8 or 1.9 Earths, which means that by July of the year, we've already burned through all the energy that we can afford to consume for the rest of the year. So, yeah, we're on a downward spiral to extinction, but now we're way off topic.
So I'll mention one comment on that. Now, the CO2 is rising in the atmosphere slightly. In the past, over the past, I don't know, 100,000 years, it's been much higher. So it's not an immediate threat to mankind as much as our lack of energy could have a major impact in our society within 30 years. On the good side, as CO2 gets higher in the atmosphere, plants are very happy. The Earth is actually greener. So there is something positive to be said about that.
Okay, go ahead.
Just a couple of things. First one, it wasn't Blade Runner, wasn't the film that you're referring to?
It was Logan's Run.
It was Logan's Run, that's correct. Now, the question I've got is, you hardly touched on anything to do with tidal power. Now, apart from the initial setup costs with tidal power, are there any running costs?
I listed it as a cheap, reliable energy source, so it is very useful in the future.
But you need an ocean, so it's only you have to have a coast. You have to have a coastline to be able to take advantage of it. Is another problem.
Yeah. There's some wear and tear because it's all equipment has wear and tear, so there's maintenance costs. But as again, they're relatively inexpensive compared to other energy sources. So that is part of our solution in the future.
There's quite a few set up, as far as I know, in Scotland, tidal estuaries, which have seemed to be very, very successful.
No doubt, you're right.
Well, thank you for your very thought-provoking talk this morning. It seems to me that the best way forward from the information that you've given is to have a balanced approach and not to rush too far down the line of decommissioning, mining, and that kind of thing. I would just make a comment because you've answered the question on hydrogen. I worked in the steel industry for 38 years until my retirement 18 months ago. And just as I was leaving, my company, Tata Steel in Europe, made a decision to invest significantly in green hydrogen. And my understanding was that there was a huge initial outlay in that, but then the payback in a number of years was relatively quick. And so that seems to be the way in which industry is going, is green hydrogen.
Yeah, that could very well be. Again, we didn't research it to that level of depth, so I can't comment any further on that. But that's entirely possible. But your point about not moving too fast, you need to, before you retire something, you need to replace it with something else. It's like putting the horse before the carriage. If you do that, you're screwed, and that's what we're doing today. We're putting the horse before the carriage. We need to do it the other way so that we don't get behind.
I'll make one more comment on that. You're absolutely right, Brad. I mean, we're very concerned of the risks of shutting things down first. But for example, shutting down a lot of oil development in the States, starting new wells, to reverse that, changing the legal requirements, the funding, the development of an oil platform, then to get the oil out, that's 10, 15 years. So if we're shutting all these down, if we decide a year from now that, oh my God, we made a big mistake, we have a big problem restarting all these systems. And that's assuming we even have the funding to do this, which is questionable. Another question here.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about methane emissions from rice fields, for instance. From cattle and from rice fields producing methane. I understand methane is 50 times more dangerous than CO2 to the environment. Can you comment on that, please?
Brad, you want to take it?
You're talking about two completely different things. Carbon dioxide is basically inert. It is toxic to humans in high concentrations, but plants love it because they consume it. So CO2 is not dangerous in any way. Methane is a flammable fuel. You can burn it, and when you burn it, it produces carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and a lot of other byproducts. So you can't really compare the two in the way of danger, because it's like comparing an apple to an orange. They're different. And how are we doing on time? How many more questions should we take here before we move on?
Greenhouse?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, agreed. Methane is a higher concentration of greenhouse gas, so it's more concerning from that direction. One point we didn't make, I just want to comment on this, is that one of the ways these dangerous pollutants get in the air and are taken out of the air is through the cycle of the forests clean out our air and the oceans. So if we're going to deforest, we're doing more harm than good. It's fine, we need to use natural resources, but they need to be replaced as we use them, at least, if not go the other way, go more green. The ocean as well is the largest source of cleaning CO2 out of the atmosphere. So if we damage our oceans, we are causing a lot of problems.
Okay, we have enough time for two more questions. I have one right here.
Okay. All over the world, down enough is a heat source, thermal energy. Is it feasible to tap into that even where it's quite deep down?
Yeah, that's thermal energy. If you look at some place like Iceland, they're doing a lot of that because there's a lot of volcanoes, so they actually heat their homes with thermal energy. So yes, that's viable, but probably only in areas that are close to fault lines and where the energy is closer to the surface. I don't know what the dangers of drilling hundreds of miles down into the core are going to create if we're going to pull the heat from down there. So yes, it is, but again, it's limited by location. And Bud, you've got...
Yeah. I was at a conference in Sweden before COVID that was talking about the economics of environment and energy consumption and consumption pattern on matters related for energy. And one of the things that we talked about was the growing proportion of energy consumption in the world by governments, enterprise, and institutions for storing data. And the mathematics of this are so astounding that if the people in this room who are just basically educated really knew what they were, it would really be frightening. And the projections for 2030 and 2050 are really amazing. I'm just wondering if any of the guys who were talking here today have more to share about that, because it really is the most troubling aspect of the whole consumption pattern for the now generation and the one that's
I would agree with that, but I haven't done any research into the numbers, so I can't give you a finite answer to that. But yeah, you're right. It is staggering.
That's part of the reason we focused on the green energy, because we do see clearly that's going to be one of our major concerns in the next 20 years. How much energy will we have, and how much energy will we need? And these two don't align very well right now.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut this off, otherwise you'll be here all day, because Brad and Bud have really opened up a can of worms, and that's good because you're using it to think. I was just thinking after their presentation, the only person that's really going to be happy is the person that's incarcerated that's going to get an electric chair. They won't have any juice. I would like to present a certificate of appreciation to these gentlemen for putting in the time and effort today. So if you put your hands together for them, and I'll... I have to apologize for it sounded like there was firecrackers going off. I think there was some problem with the sound system. I think it was the PEA, the provincial